just on behalf of the White River Indie Films Board. I'm just so happy everybody's here and very happy to introduce my colleague, Desiree Garcia. Wafic is here. Hello. Liz, I was just checking to make sure everybody's there. So we have all of our panelists. We're so glad that you guys are here. And I'm going to turn it over to Desiree from here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Samantha and Craig. So I'm delighted to be able to moderate this panel this evening. I'm professor in Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies, as well as film and media studies at Dartmouth. I don't know how much of an introduction our wonderful panelists need, but I thought I would just do a very brief one to get us started. So Yaqui Smith, delighted to virtually meet you, is an award-winning filmmaker and an associate professor of film and the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. His film, The Pandemic Chronicles, which we are discussing tonight, is distributed by Full Spectrum Features. Is it out already? Is it available?
Yes.
It is.
The,
and is
the,
it
well,
on...
the run has already happened, so now it's no longer available.
Oh, okay. Okay, good to know. So we are privileged to be able to have access to it. Jen Marlowe, also wonderful to meet you, is author, documentarian, playwright, and activist, and she wears all of those hats for the film in question this evening. Her previous films include Darfur Diaries, Message from Home, and Rebuilding Hope, Sudan's Lost Boys Return Home. And then Wafic Faour is a member of Vermonters for Justice in Palestine. He's an activist who also supports the important work of the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance, Migrant Justice, Richmond Racial Equality, and the Vermont Coalition for Ethnic and Social Equity in Schools. So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for being here and for doing the important work that you do. So watching the two films, what came across very clearly is this incredible blending of filmmaking and activism, and really using cinema as a tool for social change. And I see both of your work as taking a different approach to filming, and using filming to see and hear and think differently, and for prompting your viewer to think and see and hear differently. And so I wonder if you could talk about your approach to filming and specifically regarding these two films, what you were trying to do in order to communicate these altered ways of thinking and hearing and viewing your subjects. And I know they're very different subjects, very different kind of time and space involved, but it just seems as though there's a real kind of clear message being delivered about how we see humanity differently in both of these. And from what we would typically expect to see. So I wonder if both of you could talk about that, and maybe Yaqui, yours first, since your film kind of headlines the program, and then Jen, yours second.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. I think for me, I've always approached film from the vantage point of really, really sort of wanting to change the ways in which we see and engage with one another. Because, for me, just even being a Black man in this country, I realized that in some ways, film, media, what we see, what we hear, what we read, they sort of create a construct, right? And that's how we sort of see people, especially those who we've never really had an opportunity to be around or engage with, right? Sometimes the only way that you know about someone, right, or your only perception of a person is literally what you saw on TV, which is all very dangerous, first of all. But again, we're inundated with it, so that's how we sort of view the world. And so for me, I'm always thinking about how can I show a portrait? It's not a romanticized portrait, right? I think I do want to sort of make sure that when we talk about sort of, this idea of stereotypical images and really getting away from that, that we don't take away sort of the authenticity of the humanity of the people that we're actually talking about, because we come good, bad, and ugly, right? And I want to make sure that in anything that I create, that you see all of those sort of facets of who we are as human beings. And so when I'm thinking about the Pandemic Chronicles, I think the very first thing that was important to me was, first, I was obviously personally affected by this, as all of us have been, right? But I didn't want to just create something that only showed my point of view. I wanted to see how were others affected based upon all of these different things, right? Based upon race, based upon class, based upon gender, based upon sexuality, based upon like geographic location, right? Each of us are experiencing it very different. For example, I'm in Georgia right now, and it's so random. I walked into the hotel and no one had mask on, and I'm not used to that because in Texas, right, even now we're still wearing our masks, even though we're all fully vaccinated, right? And so again, depending upon where you are, you're affected very differently by this pandemic. And so what I wanted to do was really show the different ways that different individuals, right? One's an immigrant. The other story is about, a couple who, they haven't had an opportunity to be in a room with another person in a long time. And here they are standing across from each other. What do they do, right? How do you sort of have an intimate connection during the time of, Corona? What does that really look like? And really sort of just wanting to find the different ways into these stories, and making sure that I'm showing it again, not just from my perspective, but from other people's perspective. Obviously, um, it's still inspired by the ways in which I'm seeing this or experiencing it. But ultimately, I wanted to make sure again that I was showing the different ways that other people are dealing with it. And I want to sort of take it a little further and talk about even the way that we filmed it, because I think that also changes what we see and how we see it. Because as I'm filming this at the height, I mean, literally, we shot this a year ago. So we were a month or two into the pandemic. How do you shoot a film during that time? And that determined so much. It dictated the stories that I chose. It dictated the locations. It dictated the way that we filmed each piece. It dictated how long we shot each piece. Were people comfortable being in the same room with each other? There were all of these sort of questions that we had to answer and ask as we were developing the story. And based upon all of those components, that's how we wind up seeing the 4 vignettes that we saw, because I had to find people again that were comfortable with certain things, and then also find people who had, right, all of these production resources at their disposal, because I wasn't on set. I was literally sitting in my garage, right? And so I had to trust them to actually do the work based upon all of our conversations. And so again, as I'm thinking this through, not only am I thinking about, okay, the reality of it all, what are people actually going through, but then the practicality of it is also what are people comfortable with doing during the middle of a major global pandemic. I hope that answered your question.
It does too. And it makes me think, sort of, not only are you sort of subverting sort of, the obvious kind of stereotype, which, is sort of, the obvious thing to do here. And in the end, it's not that hard because stereotypes are so over the top. Just, doing an ordinary thing is kind of a radical act in that sense. But it reminds me of kind of the work of a Charles Burnett, right? Or a Ramel Ross, Hale County this evening, where just the kind of the quotidian portrayal of the everyday becomes this radical act, right? And your film is not necessarily about Blackness, right? But that in and of itself, it becomes a kind of statement. And I wonder what kind of reaction you've gotten from audiences because of that. I know that when Ramel Ross came to Dartmouth, I think, what was it, Johanna, maybe a year, 2 years ago now? There was an interesting reaction in the audience. There was a white gentleman in the audience who was very frank about being very confused by his film. He said, frankly, I don't know what to do with this movie. I don't know how to respond to this movie. Because the film wasn't giving him any directive, any kind of clear signs about, that he was familiar with how to hook on to interpret that movie and its representation of Blackness. So I'm just curious
Yeah,
what kind of response you've had.
yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, Charles Burnett, and I also am a huge Dardenne Brothers fan, the Dardenne Brothers, and they do the same thing, right? Where we're just watching, and these things seem so mundane and can actually be boring if you're not ready, right, for that kind of filmmaking or for those types of stories. But for me, there's like complexity, nuance, beauty in all of that, because even though we're seeing something that feels mundane, right? I just think when you put a camera on it, right, there's something heightened about it. And then that's when we start to see these links between, again, they're in France, here I am in America, and I can see so many links between the stories that they're telling and even my own personal experience because of the fact that I feel like I'm looking at a documentary at times, right? I feel like I'm not watching Marion Cotillard act. She just is. She's just doing, right? And that's what I've always wanted to do with all of my work, is make you feel like you are just happening to, you're walking down the street and you happen to see these people. You happen to be in their house. You almost feel like you shouldn't be there. I almost want to create this very sort of uncomfortable feeling in the audience where you feel like you're watching something that you should not be watching, because it's such a personal sort of thing that is happening between the actors, and even between the camera and the actors, right? Even the way that you shoot it, I think, can kind of change your perspective as well. And I think for me, that's the thing I've always wanted to do was, what if I happen to be walking by this hotel, there's a window here, and I see this thing happening in front of me? How would I react to it? How would I see it? How would my mind process it? And as I'm thinking about, again, setting up shots, setting up stories, even in my direction of actors, I'm always thinking about that. What is this sort of real thing, right, that I want the audience to take away, this visceral response I need them to have? And that's based upon, in many ways, all of the camera and the idea of a film fading into the background, right? And again, you're thinking you're watching something that's really happening in front of you. And so that's always been my approach with filmmaking.
Jen, could we move to you and tell us about your approach to filmmaking and this sort of impulse towards social activism?
Sure, yeah, thank you for that question. Yaki, I have not yet seen your film. Now I really need to. I'm very excited to see it. I don't have just one approach to filmmaking. I think if there's a connective thread to pretty much all of my projects, it's a commitment to partnering with folks for them to tell their stories on their terms as much as possible, and trying to come in and amplify that and support that. I think that's that would be the connective tissue, I think, to my approach. But then in the last couple projects, in addition to that being true still with the core story that I was telling, I started to really experiment with this question of how does it change the story depending on who the storytellers are. So both the film that was shown at the festival there is a field, and a project that I'm working on now around the story of Troy Davis. Troy was an innocent man who was executed by the state of Georgia just about 10 years ago. So with both of those projects, the importance is equally on the story being told and who the storytellers are. In the case of There Is a Field, we really wanted to explore the connections between, when you're looking at the situation facing Palestinians, particularly Palestinians who are inside 48, inside what has been the state of Israel since 1948, otherwise known as Palestinian citizens of Israel, and how those experiences have parallels to the experience of Black folks in the US vis-a-vis white supremacy, state violence, impunity, structural racism. And so in the film, the film grew out of a whole process of workshops and stage readings and performances. There was no intention initially to make a film. The film emerged in a sense, but it emerged from this idea of when activists and organizers in the movement for Black lives are performing the story of this Palestinian family whose 17-year-old son was murdered by Israeli police, then that automatically opens up the space of questioning how these structures of oppression are connected, and questioning also, I think, and this came through both through who was performing the story, but also in the interviews where the actors were reflecting on the parallels that they saw. Questions of if these oppressions are connected, then how might resistance to these oppressions also be connected? And if the resistance can be connected and the resistance can be strengthened by these movements being connected to each other, how might that lead to nurturing a joint vision of liberation? So those are the underlying questions that we were trying to explore in making that film.
It seems it's interesting that the film part came later, because it's such a cinematic film. So to my mind, it would sort of seem so intentional to be a film from beginning to end. And I think that just speaks to its power. And it seems, in asking you this initial question, I think there's so much work that's done by the actors, not only sort of on the part of sort of telling the story of Asil and his family, but also on the part of sort of educating us, the audience. And I think the film is so incredibly useful as an educational tool for schools, for social movement groups, because there's such a wonderful sort of instruction that happens over the course of the film as the actors are coming to a better understanding of what happened to Asil, and these concepts of settler colonialism, and what that means to have one's history and one's identity erased, right? What it means to sort of have this connection where the unequal treatment at the hands of police, that happens, thousands of miles away, and to have that kind of connection. It seems as though there's this great instruction that's happening before their eyes, and therefore before our eyes, the audience, so that there's just this wonderful educational process that goes on over the course of the film that would seem like it would lend itself to a kind of film as activism as the film evolves. I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear there, but it just seemed like there's the film as a tool, and then there's the kind of educational process that goes on inside the film as well.
Right,
that I think
and that
there's
was
two levels.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad that came across. And that was really, when I said that there was no intention to initially make a film, that was one of the reasons why we decided to make a film. We were doing these workshops all around the country, partnering with different organizations and activists and movement for Black lives, where each of those workshops we would spend a week partnering with a community. And in that week, there was an intense educational process where they were learning about Palestine, but also making those connections, having those conversations about looking at how settler colonization, structural racism, state violence, how all of that played out in Palestine and how all of that played out here. And not to say that all of it is, of course, none of it is cut and paste the same, but there are still strong parallels that were being explored. And then those workshops ended with a staged reading where folks were doing the stage reading for their larger community. So they would be inviting their family, friends, colleagues. And so each of these workshops ended with this stage reading. And that the power of those processes was what convinced us that, all right, we actually need to film this. We need to film this process, and we need to film the performance of the story. And so we reached out to all the folks who had done those workshops and invited anyone who wanted to apply for like a return retreat. And that's when we brought folks to Penasco, New Mexico. So those were all folks. They were one or two from each of the different workshops we had done. So they didn't know each other, but they had all once been through the process of engaging with the play and performing it. And then we were going deeper into all those questions this time around, and then filming the whole thing.
Wow, that's so enlightening to hear about the process, because when you watch it as a film, you assume that they all have this deep connection to each other and they've been performing it for ages. So that's interesting.
Yeah, well, there's I think there's something about the process of theater also that really nurtures very quickly those connections. So we were in Penasco for about 5 or 6 days together preparing, and the filming happened in 1 day or 2 days. The interviews were 1 day, and then filming the performance was 1 day. And by the time we got there, even though it was only 5 or 6 days, the relationships were really authentically connected and deep. I think there's something in theater in that process, and in the way that folks need to make themselves vulnerable, that goes to the heart of what's being explored really quickly, and then also goes to the heart of forging genuine connections, which I think was another piece of the power we were trying to document.
Yeah, well, speaking of connections, that's another sort of aspect of this that I think unites these two films, sort of finding connection and experiencing kind of struggle together. How do we establish a connection with each other through a common struggle or conflict? And what does humanity's resilience look like? With the Pandemic Chronicles, I was struck, Yaki, with how sort of constantly sort of seeking connection through sort of physical objects. So through the masks or gloves or phones or the mail slot in the door, right? Constantly through these material objects, trying to find a kind of physical connection with one another. And then There Is a Field, it takes a slightly different form through the actors' process and learning about Palestinian struggle, likening it to their own, right? They're trying to find a connection to Asil through the words in the script, right? And digging into their own sort of memory and personal experience in order to find that emotional connection with Asil and his family. And so I felt like there was this kind of sort of connection between the two films in their sort of seeking how people find connection with one another in the midst of conflict. I don't know if either of you can speak to that more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I mean, the way that we've been connecting, I mean, even right now, right? Although we're here together, there's still a barrier between us, right? Because I can't, again, reach out and touch any of you all. We can't have that conversation that we probably would have after the film screens and we sit in a bar or outside of the lobby of a theater and really can get into it. And so I think for the last 18 months, we've all learned how to connect vis-a-vis these physical objects, right? Right, literally Zoom within 2 weeks of you're in a physical setting in school, and then within 2 weeks it's like, okay, now teach on Zoom. What is Zoom, right? I mean, it's like not only what is Zoom, but now how do I teach this film class virtually, right? So it's like all of these things that we used to have that we could do and literally physically touching each other, we've had to learn how to work across these new barriers. And I think with the Pandemic Chronicle, I think distance obviously is the first barrier, right? I mean, I think about the nurse, right? And you're talking about the mail slot. It's like, yeah, she can't even reach out and touch her family. She can't kiss her kids goodbye. She can't embrace her husband. She literally can't go into the refrigerator and get, something to drink after a long day's work. She can't do any of that in her home. And so again, there's this sort of disconnect, yet having to find a way to reconnect or connect through these disconnections is what I was really looking for throughout the film. Even the couple, right? Here they are literally physically in a room with each other, but there's still a barrier where, like, what does sex look like during the time of Corona when you don't know this person that you're standing in a room with? There still has to be some physical barrier between you two. And that's what I was thinking about through all of these, that in fact, we've all had to sort of learn a new way of living and being, which is also interesting because then when you think about the fact that now maybe in the fall we're back together, how has this distance affected the way that we will be with each other when we are physically together, right? Have we lost social skills a bit? Do we know how to connect with each other? Is it weird? Like, I have colleagues who started at the beginning of the pandemic, and I saw them the other day or last week at a graduation, and I realized, you know what, this is only the second time I've actually been in a room with you, yet I feel like I know you very well, right? But it was like, no, this is only the second time. Like, you met me when I was going through my interview process, but we've never seen each other since then. And again, how do you now reconnect with people that you've been connected with through this physical barrier, yet now you're able to be back in a physical setting with? What does that connection really look like, right? And so again, I think throughout the Pandemic Chronicles, those were the questions I was constantly asking myself.
Yeah, and I think with There Is a Field, the connection is actually what the film is about, essentially. And I think in a lot of projects, if you're working with actors, you want them to find an entry point into the story that they're telling, that where they can connect to it personally and through their own experience, and that's in order to enable them to tell that story most authentically. But with the case of There Is a Field, the purpose of developing those connections wasn't in order to elicit the most powerful performance from the activist actors, but the purpose was exploring that connection and exploring what in Asil's story felt familiar, what in his family's story felt like similar to their experiences here in the US? What didn't feel familiar? And then again, always leading to these questions of if these oppressions are connected and similar, then what does resistance look like if that is in connection to each other? And what does liberation look like if joint visions of liberation are being forged? So that connection was really like I could say the main character of the film was the exploration of those relationships and those connections.
Samantha has a question. She's posted in the chat. In another filmmaker talk, Yaki spoke about the moment of rupture, seeing one's identity othered by screen representation. I'm interested to hear from Wafic about the experience of seeing American actors playing Palestinian characters in a play shaped by an American director. Were there any moments of rupture? What connected or missed? How would you encourage us? How would you encourage us to go even deeper into understanding this experience? I think, is that what you meant, Samantha?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Wafic. I live in Richmond, Vermont. Thank you, Les, for inviting me. I watched There Is a Field, and from the beginning it was personal, because maybe Jen knows Arabi, the town where it took place, which is next to my original town, which is I am from Shab, Upper Galilee. So all these towns where the Land Day takes place on the 70s, the original Land Day, and it took place just 2 weeks ago and continuous. Arabi, Sakhnin, Tamra, Nahef, Shab. Even though I'm Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, but these names of the villages where my neighbors live, because what happened when we became refugees, the same people from villages around each other's, the neighbor moved together, and the same people living in refugee camp as if we still in Palestine, because this is the farthest connection we have. So the people from Upper Galilee, from Sa'sa, Sohmata, Sakhnin, Arabi, Tamra, Sha'ab, we lived on the same refugee camps. It was personal on that moment. I think Jen did a fantastic job throwing more questions than telling us answers on her artwork. Definitely, as the movie progressed, I felt that the wonderful sisters and brothers from the Black artist community who perform it, I felt it's coming from the heart more and more. What I meant by only scratching the answer, we didn't go deep. Where are the parallel between the Black people struggle in this country and the Palestinian, which is, it didn't stop on the policing, but the underneath of it, the systemic racism on education, healthcare, housing, just name it, you're going to see parallel with the Black and brown community here and with the indigenous people on this land. So if you throw it, the Palestinian question on any of our movement here, if it's migrants, if Black, brown, indigenous, you're going to find the same conflict. It is settler colonialism. It is the same roots, United States and Israel. Israel, for me, is United States, but it's mini-me, you know. It's a brutal. Your film is timely now after last 2 weeks of the battle, because a lot of people, they think it is over one place or another, but Israel succeeded over 70, or thought they succeeded over 73 years to eliminate the Palestinian identity. So as you put it, 1948 people, or the people of Arabi, Israeli Arabs, you know, and 2 weeks ago, the Palestinians in a magnificent way proved that they are one people wherever you're going to put them, and our relationship is one, and the occupation is the enemy is one, and our future is one. Thank you.
Thank you, Wafic. Are there other questions from other attendees? Please don't be shy.
Can I just respond for a moment to something that Wafic mentioned? Thank you, Wafic. It was really moving to hear your thoughts. And I just want to say that I agree with you that I think a shortcoming in the film is that there was not enough of an exploration of the underlying structural racism that undergirds, that there was a focus on state violence and police brutality. And that is real and that is important, but I think there was a missed opportunity to go a little bit deeper in exploring what are the structural elements that undergird that in terms of structural oppression. So I appreciate that you highlighted that.
It did strike me, though, I thought a really poignant moment in the film was the discussion between the children and their father, and sort of the place names that they are encouraged not to forget, even though the state system encourages them to do so. And he's reminding them that the soil is theirs, right? That the soil belonged to them before it was Israeli. And it reminds me, you know, and again, this goes back to thinking how wonderful an educational tool this film is. It reminds me of thinking about US-Mexico borderlands and thinking about, you know, the border we didn't cross the border crossed us, right? And thinking about how speaking Spanish was, you know, aggressively punished in schools for many, many decades in Texas, for example, and the sort of violent oppression of culture and ethnic studies, and you know, just the way that state violence can be enacted in many different kinds of ways, you know, other than police brutality. And I feel like that one moment in the film really signals all of that, and that could be a wonderful teaching moment for anyone to be able to kind of draw out all of those various kinds of connections.
Thanks. Yeah, we did one of the workshops that I was mentioning with the group of it was half the group was Palestinian artists and activists who lived in New York, and half were folks who were First Nations indigenous from Turtle Island, artists and activists who all now are living on Lenape territory in Manhattan. And there were things that there were different moments in the play that group connected to. That were not necessarily the moments that when we were doing the workshops with activists in the movement for Black Lives weren't the first moments that jumped out to them. And the moment you just identified was one of them, when Seal's father takes a handful of soil and says, "You are the roots of this land. You are the trees. You are the stones. You are the soil." The indigenous First Nations from Turtle Island folks, absolutely, that was the first line that they spoke about as feeling a deep connection to.
That's such some beautiful words. And I wonder how much of that script, Jen, comes directly from you, and how much of it were you basing off of letters that were coming from the family? I'm just wondering what the source material was that you had at your fingertips.
It's documentary material. So the main basis of the film came from a process of 15 years of interviews with Nardine, with the Seal's older sister. The main bulk of those interviews, I would say, were in the first 8 years, but then every time I was back in Arabe or Haifa, we would sit down and do some more. So that's the basis. And then I interviewed also all of the other family members, and then all of the writing that Asil himself left behind. So that Peaceful Thoughts essay, that's Asil's own writing. That email exchange between Asil and Nardine in the beginning, those are real. It's not the full emails, I edited them down, but Nardine gave me access to the actual email exchanges between her and her brother. So it was all documentary. The court scenes all came from the actual transcripts of the Commission of Inquiry, which turned out to be, of course, a whitewash. So it was, and there were some privileges I took with tweaking some things here and there, but essentially it was, I'd say, 90% documentary material.
Can I add something?
Mm-hmm.
Even when we talked about police, if you take it, you didn't make the connection between the training between Israeli police forces and the American police forces. And this is very important because those two communities, Palestinians and the Black people on the cities, are hurting from this connection and from this collaboration. The other thing I viewed, because you highlighted maybe intentionally or not, with the Seeds of Peace organization, that it is the only positive things I saw from that organization is your film, that they stood with the victim family. But beside that, that organization remind me of white organization popping left and right on this country. They call themselves Equity and Equality in support of Black Lives Matters or migrants or etc. But at the end, when you are part of this organization, which is I am part of it in my town in Richmond, you will discover it is self-serving. That they organize to feel good that we are talking about racism, prejudice, and all these historical problems. But when you go to goals and projects, you will discover it's just because they want to feel comfortable about themselves. And Seeds of Peace is one of those organizations, because you have to ask yourself, major question, why to bring Palestinian and Israeli to Vermont to know each other when the holy question is down there? You know, they never did a camp down there, but they're going to come to the north end of Vermont to have a camp, so they will meet each other. And after they go back, the Israeli become 18 years old on the checkpoints to stop the same Palestinians and to shoot at them if it's occurred. Thank you.
Thank you, Wafic. So we have some questions in the chat. Nicole asks, how are you moving forward with this acting and activist work? I believe that's meant for Jen.
So with There Is a Field, we're continuing to work with the play itself, also not just the film. So we're working right now with activists connected to the Highlander Center in Tennessee, who are working on a staged reading of the play. So we're continuing to use it as a active theatrical protest to build connections. And then with the film, we're trying to use the film as an opportunity to build relationships and build conversations. So we've been reaching out to groups in different towns, trying to see if there are both Black and Palestinian activists in those towns who would want to watch the film together, have a conversation, and use that as a starting point to actually support each other's struggles and to actually be in relationship with each other. Our hope is that the film is not only raising questions that people are thinking about and questioning, and I appreciate that Wafic brought up Seeds of Peace. I hope that the film introduces a lot of question marks about organizations like Seeds of Peace through that dialogue between Asil and Nardine, because I very much agree with Wafic's critique of that organization and similar organizations. So we're hoping to use the film in ways that are not only raising questions, but that are actually a part of concretely building relationships and connections that will translate into joint organizing.
And then also, Jen, for you, Liz asks, how did Asil's family react to the play and the film?
think I mean, I partnered very closely with them. I mean, every step of this whole project was always done in relationship with them. So Asil's younger brother, Bara, was actually came on board and really helped with the finishing of the film, and was like a field producer. So all of the archival footage of Asil and of his family and, Bara helped find that. And I know for Bara, and I believe this is true for the rest of the family from my conversations, that what felt most important to them was that element of solidarity. I think it's complicated for them for Asil's story to be lifted up above the other Palestinian martyrs, right? Asil was not the only Palestinian martyr because he was a peace activist. His case got attention that the other martyrs' cases didn't get. And in fact, Nardine says that in the film, right? She says, "I love you, brother, but you're not better than the others who were killed." So I think it's complicated for the family when there are projects that might be perceived as elevating Asil's that Asil's life or that his story has more importance than the other Palestinian martyrs. I think what they appreciated about this project was that it was trying to create that solidarity, and that it was Asil's story being used as an educational tool to build those connections.
And Jordan asked a question that I think actually is relevant to both you, Jen, and Yaki, on the idea that the brutality being experienced in Israel and the United States have similarities, but also can't be cut and pasted, as expressed very helpfully early on in this discussion. Are there certain differences and/or similarities that you find particularly worth focusing on in terms of thinking of ways forward? This may be too broad a question.
I've been talking a lot. I think Yaki should jump in.
Well, it's interesting because I think one of the things I immediately think about, there's a great book by Angela Davis, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And she sort of talks about these links between like Palestine and sort of the Black Power movement and sort of what's going on. And one of the things that I think strikes me is, one of the things she talks about is the sort of danger of individualism, right? And how as a sort of collective, there has to be a collective consciousness around liberation. To your earlier point, Jen, this idea that if these sort of atrocities that are being wielded, right, on the Palestinians is very similar to the atrocities that are being wielded on Black people in America, the question becomes, what are the links for liberation? Like, what are the ways in which we can begin to have a discussion about sort of liberating both Palestine and also liberating Black Americans here in America? And for me, one of the things I'm always thinking about is the idea that, for me, one of the very functions of like capitalism and white supremacy is to make these things individual struggles, because it sort of takes the power away from the people. Because if we can't sit in a room and have discussions and begin to look at the links, just like when Wafi, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but when you talked about the ways in which the police force in Palestine are trained in the same ways in which the police force in America are trained, those are conversations that we need to have. Because if in fact, I'm talking about, again, two completely different countries, yet the ways in which the police forces are trained to brutalize a certain sort of sector of people, those people need to start discussing that and figure out, wait a minute, what are the things that they're talking about? What are the ways in which they're going to brutalize us in these two different places? And then, okay, what are the ways in which we can begin to create a roadmap for our liberation? I don't even know if I'm answering the question. I'm just talking now. But I just think that it's important that these conversations happen and that we stop thinking that this struggle is different from that struggle and this other struggle, because they're all the same. Because we'd be hard pressed to find any place in the world where white supremacy, where racism, where capitalism has not literally ravaged parts of those parts of the world. And I think if that's the case, then the blueprint for that kind of ravaging, also there must be within that the blueprint for the liberation, but we have to have those discussions. And I'm not sure, again, if I'm answering the question, but I think what has to happen again is that we have to begin, and I haven't seen the film, but it sounds like you're making these parallels in a very poignant way. And I think it starts with that. It starts with creating the parallels. And then once we can sit down and have these discussions, then we can begin to see how these things are really, really sort of working. This idea of racism, repression, and all these things, they're happening everywhere. But again, we're not having the discussion that we need to have. I don't know if I answered the question.
I think you answered it better than I could.
Wafic, did you want to join in on that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, it is not only how they train, the Israeli training actual American police from here, and chiefs of police, and Jewish Voice for Peace have a whole campaign of that called Deadly Exchange, and it is clear how much the connection between these kind of training. To go back to what can we do about it? Sadly, our Black, brown community, and every community over here understand the connection, and we understand the struggle, we understand the goal, but it is becoming radioactive connection. Any organization, if it's a Black Lives Matters or Women's March, etc., the moment they mention Palestine, the Israeli lobby here are going to come after them. The moment they connect the struggle of Black and brown people here, or the migrant people here, you're going to find a nonprofit organization cutting funding for this organization and going after them and label them anti-Semitic. It is brutal here as much as in Palestine, Israel, the struggle. The Black Lives Matters, they are beyond any organization of making the connections, you know? And it's not from Black Lives Matters movement only. It goes to the 60s. The first people I saw from United States are Black American coming to Beirut, to the refugee camp to visit us, you know, Black leaders, including Muhammad Ali. We saw him in my refugee camp, in Burj al Baraj refugee camp. We met the Black leaders. We met indigenous people, tribes in Beirut. They came in. The connection is deep and historical and bad. But the moment you do it, the moment you talk about it, the moment you publish it, AIPAC will come after you. Israeli lobby going to come after you, and they're going to label you anti-Semitic, and you're going to go, and you see it everywhere, from the Women's March to Black Lives Matters to every organization. They are losing funding because the Israeli lobby at work on this.
I think that maybe I'm just being naively hopeful right now, but I feel like within the horror that we saw in the last 3 weeks in terms of the escalation of violence and repression in Palestine, one thing that felt hopeful to me is that although I agree with Wafic, I think that the effort from folks, like AIPAC, folks who want to support Israel unconditionally, that pressure is always still there. I don't think it's working in the same way. It feels like there's a seismic shift that happened in these last couple of weeks. There was 20-some people, members of Congress, who stood in the congressional record and spoke out against the brutality that Israel was committing and the human rights violations. That is unprecedented. That has never happened before. I think that the Palestine demonstrations that happened all over the country on Nakba Day, on May 15th, were like the size of those demonstrations, and also at least the one here in Seattle, in Duwamish territory, the diversity of people who came out on the streets was something I hadn't seen before. And I think there might be some connection also to the revitalization of the movement for Black lives after the murder of George Floyd last year. I think there's a shift of consciousness about how structural racism happens that maybe has allowed folks in the US to make like folks who aren't necessarily directly impacted or who benefit, folks who benefit from white supremacy, right? So folks who look like me. I think there's been more connecting the dots that is happening now than I've seen previously. So I think we're at a moment where in terms of at least what's happening here in the US side, there's some hopefulness that something can shift.
Jen, have you received any kind of adverse reaction to your film thus far?
Not from this film per se, certainly from, I mean, I do a lot of work around Palestine. So certainly from other projects that I've done, I've received angry responses, angry reactions. Sometimes if I'm giving a talk or on comments to an article that I wrote or a film that I made, but there hasn't been that I'm aware of, at least specifically related to this film.
Other questions?
I don't have a question, but I kind of want to respond to what Jen just said, because I agree, but then I kind of disagree, not in a bad way. But the reason I say that is because, like, I do agree that there has been an elevated consciousness around sort of the idea of like racism and white supremacy. But what I see, and maybe I'm talking about it from sort of being a university administrator, is there is still so much pushback when we start getting into like the real meat of what needs to happen in order to see these changes be long lasting, right? There's an excitement almost around it, right? Like with George Floyd, right? It's like we're at our homes, we're watching this happen, and people hit the streets in ways I hadn't seen before. You know, people were excited about it, but then 4 months later, right, when we really start to get into the weeds of, so these are the real things that must happen, right, in order for those atrocities not to take place, there becomes a resistance to that, because I think one of the number one things we have to remember is that there's sadly a benefit to things remaining the way that they are. Somebody is benefiting off of my oppression, right? Somebody is benefiting off of the fact that I, again, am being redlined, or that I can't get a home loan like someone else, or that I can't live in a certain neighborhood, or that, you know, there's a plateau with how high I can go in my career path because of the color of my skin. Somebody's benefiting from that. And the minute we start to really talk about, okay, in order for there to be change, you know, somebody has to be willing to kind of get up and leave the room and begin to let some of us in who've not had opportunities to be in these spaces. Ooh, you should see how now the conversation begins to completely shift, because it's okay when I'm marching, it's okay when I'm doing my thing and pumping my fist out there with you. But when I really say that the way we change, because of the sort of the systemic way that this thing has been really ingrained in all of us, when I start to say that the way we change is you giving up something, people, the whole conversation shifts, and people become so resistant to that because they realize that in some ways, to your point, and you said it, they're benefiting from my oppression, and they don't want to necessarily admit that, and also they don't want to begin to dismantle it, because dismantling it means that you must move out of the way and you must give up something. Because obviously when I talk about you benefited from it and I didn't, that means that there was something. Back to I love that this land is yours. I don't know exactly what the quote was from the film, but we start talking, we get into that thing that, wait a minute, who actually has right to this land that we live on? The fact that, you know, I think of my own campus, that, you know, Black people helped to build a campus that they for so long could not even come and be educated on, right? And when we start to talk about dismantling structures, that means that, wait a minute, some of those who have benefited must move out of the way so that those who have not benefited from it can finally get what is rightfully theirs. Not something that they're not asking for a handout, they're not begging for anything. They're actually asking you to give to them what is theirs. And that's where it becomes such a complicated discussion, you know?
Samantha.
First, I just want to thank all of the speakers so much. This is just such a powerful conversation. I'm so moved by everything you all are saying. And I wanted to just, I guess, picking up on what Yaki was just talking about, but the title that we chose for this conversation was Filmmaking to Dismantle Supremacy. And I just wanted to ask, as filmmakers and artists, one of the things that concerns me, I guess, is sometimes when films take a strong point of view, as this film does, and it's one that I personally am aligned with. So I'm wanting to absorb as much as I can. I'm also Jewish and American, and I think about the shift that and the dialogue that I'm observing within the American Jewish community. And I want to ask the panelists to speak to when working on projects and thinking about achieving change of consciousness. We have a shift generationally towards more universalist values in the Jewish community in America, but how can we contextualize films like this in a way that might bring down some of the defenses that for some Jews feel very raw of feeling, utterly displaced and, generationally only one generation removed from near genocide in Europe, which is so, fundamental to the defense mechanism emotionally to find commonality in the grief and displacement that was imposed upon the Palestinian people that, that might be pointing towards that deeper reconciliation. Because right now, just the sort of defense, like it's a literal political security apparatus, but it's also, this deep emotional structure that I find very hard. And point to point, I'm trying to have the courage to have conversations with people within the Jewish community, but it's really painful. So I'm just curious how, particularly Jen, maybe if you've facilitated any kind of conversation with your film in American Jewish contexts, how you've helped navigate those sort of currents. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Samantha, for that question. With this film, I have not facilitated conversations with American Jewish community. It's for the film is the goal of the film, and the target audience is really about the film being a space to build Black Palestinian solidarity. So that is, I mean, obviously any open screening, anyone is welcome to come. Certainly there's been many Jewish Americans who have seen the film. I'm Jewish American. But that's not our target goal. So that's not what we're like, how we're reaching out and how we're building around the film. But I've certainly been in many conversations around my work on Palestine with Jewish American communities. And I think, one of the ways I actually, when I'm speaking, I wrote a book with a Palestinian colleague of mine a number of years ago called The Hour of Sunlight. And he was not able to get a visa to the US. And so I found myself being the one on book tour representing the book for both of us. And in that case, we were very intentionally reaching out to synagogues and to Jewish community spaces. And one of the ways I would always frame the talk, in the beginning of the talk, I would say, this is, I've been always taught that there's two sides to this conflict. I have chosen a side. I've done so unapologetically. And then people would always kind of shift in their seats and get uncomfortable. And then I would say, okay, I'm going to just put that aside from now. I'd go on to the whole book talk about Sammy's life. But then at the end, I would bring up Aseel and Aseel's murder, because that's written about in the book from Sammy's perspective, who also Sammy knew Aseel. And I talked about the letter. I talked about how Aseel's friends had stood with him and had stood by his side, how his friends from Seeds of Peace. And I also then spoke about the letter that Nardine writes to those friends, which is actually quoted in the film, where she says, "Dear friends of Aseel, of mine, of ours, it gives me so much strength to see you demonstrate for Aseel and for justice. I'm not good with words, so I'll just say I'm proud of you. I'm proud to be your friend, and I'm proud to be on your side of this struggle." And then I kind of interrogate that, like, what does that mean? Here's a Palestinian woman speaking to a group of Jewish Israeli young people saying, I'm proud to be on your side of this struggle. She's saying that she's on the same side. How could that be if the sides are Israeli versus Palestinian? And then I try to flip that notion on its head, and by bringing up the question of, like, well, maybe the sides aren't Israeli versus Palestinian. Maybe the sides are those who want to perpetrate oppression and supremacy and injustice because they benefit from it, And that side includes Israelis and some Palestinians and Jews and some Christians and Muslims, and those who, and borrowing from Yakis, from some of what you said earlier, those who are really invested in trying to dismantle systems of privilege and power, even and especially when those systems privilege them. And are committed to dismantling them and are committed to truly building in their stead structures of true liberation and structures of true justice. And those sides include Palestinians and Jews and Christians and Muslims and Israelis. And of course, you can take that context and put it in a US context as well. And so that's what I see the sides as being. And that's a way I try to offer when I'm speaking to Jewish American communities, a way to offer a new framing of how to look at what that means to be on a side.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Well, we are at time. It is 7:01, and I know that some of you are on a tight schedule to move on to other obligations. So thank you so much for being here. Especially thank you to our panelists, Yaki, Jen, and Wafic. I can't think of a better way to end our wonderful festival on such an inspirational note. So thank you all.
Thank you. It was awesome.